A Child is Born, A Beginner's Guide to Nativity Stories by Amy Jill Levine, Chapter 1, pages 17 through 30. Isaac, the occasion for laughter. When Abraham was 99, by my math, this makes Ishmael 13, he and God have another chat. God repeats the promise that Abraham will be the ancestor of a multitude of nations, Genesis 17, verse 4. Changes Abram's name to Abraham, father of many, chapter 17, verse 5, and states that he will be exceedingly fruitful, chapter 17, verse 6. I wonder if Ishmael was listening. If Abraham is going to be the ancestor of a multitude, Ishmael will have a lot of work ahead. God then promises Abraham and his descendants an eternal covenant, chapter 17, verse 7, which includes all of Canaan. In turn, Abram is to circumcise himself, I can't imagine, and every male member. I've carefully phrased this point of his household, chapter 17, verses 10 through 13. While Abraham is pondering this, or Ishmael listening, I suspect his initial delight at the idea of multiple offspring was dampened. Message, God drops another bombshell. Sarah will bear a son. Given her menopausal status, Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, "Can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, give birth?" Genesis 17:17. I would have laughed too. This laughter, the idea that the unbelievable, the unthinkable can be thought and believed, and more can come true, is part of the biblical tradition. The laughter is joyful. Birth stories of Ishmael, Isaac, Moses, Samson, Samuel, John, Jesus prompt us to ask, what if? The Bible invites us to open our imaginations and to recover the innocence of childhood when all things seem possible. I think of Mark chapter 10, verse 15, where Jesus tells his followers, "Whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." And of Jesus calling his disciples little children in John chapter 13, verse 33. Mustard seeds do not become giant trees, but to imagine that a small seed can turn into something magnificent may be what drives the next great invention or movement. Postmenopausal women do not give birth. I put myself in this category and just as well, but age should not hinder the fertile mind. Abraham, who is not convinced about Sarah's ability, or perhaps also his, to participate in this project, reminds God that he already has a son. "Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight," Genesis 17:18. God reassures Abraham both that Sarah will give birth to a son who is to be named Isaac. The name comes from the Hebrew root meaning to laugh, and that all will be well, really well, with Ishmael. In the next scene, Abraham circumcises the 13-year-old Ishmael, and he himself circumcised as well. Genesis 17, verses 23 through 27, a scene that, as we will see in chapter 4, echoes in the circumcisions of John and of Jesus. The covenant has prevailed through thousands of years. Conception and birth of Isaac. One never knows when visitors will bring astonishing news. When my Ring doorbell chimes, the announcement concerns someone taking the dogs out, or in Delivery People, nice but not earth-shattering, and the rare missionary who climbs up the driveway, always interesting. But to this point, no angel at the door has announced that I will become pregnant, and my age, God forbid. But the Bible opens the door to remarkable events. According to Genesis chapter 18, verse 1, the Lord, Hebrew Yahweh, appeared to Abraham as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham is resting. Given the story of Hagar and the recognition of enslaved people in the household, we might wonder whether they had the same privilege of sitting in the tent rather than toiling in the fields. Suddenly, Abraham looks up and sees 3 men. Perhaps he had been daydreaming or napping and missed their arrival. Perhaps they dropped down from heaven. Seeing them, he runs from the tent to meet them and bowed down to the ground, Genesis chapter 18, verse 2. Abraham has had supernatural encounters before. Bowing to the ground is what most people do with a theophany. On the other hand, I have always had the nagging thought that he was really happy for the company. The theology here shows the impossibility of pinning this God down. First, we hear that Yahweh appeared. Now we have three men. For some Christians, the three represent the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. For Jews, traditionally, the three are God and two angels. The two angels will, in the next chapter, peel off and visit Abraham's nephew Lot in Sodom. It doesn't go well for Sodom. In the New Testament, Hebrews 13, verse 2, uses the scene to encourage hospitality. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that some have entertained angels without knowing it. The identity of the figures who visit Abraham remains just beyond our grasp. Something revelatory, supernatural, extraordinary is about to happen. We can contrast Abraham's reaction to that of Hagar, who, upon encountering an angel /God/both, shows no fear. The angel speaks. She speaks back. Good for her. She also sets the scene for Mary, who, upon meeting the angel Gabriel, does not prostrate herself. Luke only notes that upon hearing the angel's words, "Hail Mary," or more accurately, "Greetings, favored one," that she was much perplexed by his words and pondered what sort of greeting this might be. Luke chapter 1, verses 28 through 29. Divine greetings require interpretation. Abraham then bustles with activity, or better, he spends time telling other people what to do. Genesis lavishes attention on the details of his hospitality. He calls one of the visitors "my Lord," Hebrew, Adoni, Greek, Kyrie, the same term as Kyrios, Lord, the title given to Jesus. Christians, reading the Septuagint, would come to see in the use of the term Lord, Kyrios, a reference to Jesus. This is fabulous. Reading Genesis 18 together with Luke 1, we have both the prediction of Gabriel that Mary will conceive and have a child, in the prediction in the Greek by a figure later Christians identified as Jesus, telling Abraham and Sarah that they will have a child. Jesus is both the good news and, in Genesis 18, in retrospect, the deliverer of good news. Back to Abraham. He tells the men to stay rather than to pass by, and he asks that water be brought so that the men can wash their feet. Genesis 18, verse 4. Then Abraham offers a little water for their feet and a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on. Genesis 18, verses 4 through 5. One could take this comment as a less than subtle hint. Stay for a snack, but don't plan on staying for dinner or spending the night. More likely, he is being modest. When the men agree, they know that their host has more in mind than a quick snack. Abraham rushes, Hebrew, mahor, into the tent to Sarah and says, "Make ready quickly." Same word, mahor. Sarah is to act as Abraham acted. 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes. Genesis 18, verse 6. So much for a little bread. Moreover, the biblical text suggests that Abraham had both servants and enslaved people to do this domestic work. By having Sarah prepare the cakes by her own hand, he is honoring his guests. The chapter does not record what Sarah thought. The term bread appears 297 times in the Bible, and the number rises when we include references to cakes and food in general. Any text can provide insight into any other text. The technical term for this approach to reading is intertextuality. When we read our story of Abraham and Sarah in light of the Gospels, here are 5 of many more takeaways, or takeouts. First, a little water for the feet reminds us of Luke 7 and John 12, where a woman, Mary the sister of Martha and John, anoints Jesus' feet at a meal, and especially of John 13, where Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, in John's version of the Last Supper. Abraham establishes the model of serving others, and Jesus continues this model as an example of hospitality, discipleship, and service. Second, Jesus will reuse those 3 measures. According to Matthew 13, verse 33, see also Luke 13, 21, he told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and hid in, the NRSV reads mixed in, which is not what the Greek verb crypto, as in cryptology, means, 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Reading Genesis in light of the Gospels, we find that Sarah's task is pregnant with meaning. Angelic messengers are sure signs that the kingdom of heaven is breaking in, but so is any hospitality of generosity. When meals are shared, the divine presence is welcome. Third, the kingdom of heaven is about assessing time. In Genesis 18, Abraham rushes, Sarah rushes. There are moments we take our time and moments when we move with haste. The narrative slows down the action to describe the haste. It can prompt us to wonder about those moments when we take our time and when we think, now. I'm reminded of my own moments of hospitality. I'm a terrible cook, but I do have things on hand. Rather than spend time putting together the perfect antipasto or fruit salad, I'd rather rush through the food preparation and spend time with my guests. Fourth, while Abraham speaks of a little bread, 3 measures is about 60 pounds, more than enough to feed 1 husband and 3 angels. Traditionally, as we'll see with Samson in chapter 2, angels do not eat. Abraham is abounding in generosity, which sends us to the Bible's other miraculous feedings, from the manna in the wilderness to the prophet Elijah who orders the widow of Zarephath to make me a little cake, and when she does, despite her lack of resources during a drought, Elijah provides a jar of meal that will not be emptied and a jug of oil that will not fail until the rains come, in 1 Kings 17:8-14. Jesus alludes to this scene in his synagogue sermon in Luke 4:25-26. Upping the game, Elisha feeds 100 people and even obtains leftovers with only 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain, 2 Kings 4:42-44. These early meals also anticipate Jesus' feeding more than 5,000 men besides women and children in Matthew 14:13-21. See also Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6, the only miracle story appearing in all 4 Gospels. Fifth, the image of baking bread is also an image of pregnancy. As the crude expression, she has a bun in the oven, signals, pregnancy is in the air. Abraham then runs, at 99, good for him, to fetch a calf, gives it to a young man who rushed, Mahor, there's a lot of Mahoring going on, to prepare it, Genesis 18, verse 7. The meal has become a team effort. I wonder if this young man, Hebrew, Nahor, is Ishmael, since in Genesis 21, verse 12, following Sarah's order that Hagar and Ishmael be expelled, God tells Abraham, do not be distressed because of the young man, Nahor, and because of your enslaved woman. Genesis 21, verse 17, 18, 19, and 20 all refer to Ishmael as a young man, Nahor. And if he is Ishmael, we can only speculate as to how he would have reacted to the visitor's annunciation. The hospitality scene ends in Genesis 18, verse 8, when Abraham takes curds, milk, and the calf and sets the meal before the strangers. So much for just a little water and a little bread. Abraham stands under the tree while they eat. 8 verses about hospitality that is overbaked or over-regged, but this passage is not over-easy. The story is supposed to be about conception, not about curds and calf. Finally comes the prediction. The visitors begin by asking where Sarah is. I'd like to think that they wanted to thank her for the cakes. I'm also curious as to why they would ask. Don't they know? Or were they checking to see if Abraham knew? To anticipate our chapter 2, the story of Samson's conception, Manoah does not initially know about his wife's encounter with an angel in the fields. To anticipate our chapter 3, it is not clear that Elkanah knows about Hannah's vow to God or conversation with the priest Eli. For chapter 4, it is not clear when or even if Mary told Joseph about Gabriel's visit. What secrets do we keep, and why? Abraham informs the visitors that Sarah is in the tent. Were I writing this text, I would have had Abraham inviting her to join the gathering. The scene suggests the stereotypical 1950s household, with the woman in the kitchen and the men outside smoking cigars and talking about important matters. One of the visitors announces that he will return when Sarah bears a son. Since Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, and it had since ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women, Genesis 18, verse 11, Sarah, listening, burst out laughing. I'm delighted that she was listening. She did the baking. Why should she be deprived of the conversation? I'm also delighted that the Bible mentions menopause, if delicately. What a great occasion to make a sermon relevant to probably half the members of the congregation. Finally, I'm delighted with Sarah's reaction. Not only does she laugh, which is a great thing because there is often very little to laugh about, she thinks about what this prediction means. The NRSVUE has Sarah wonder, after I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I be fruitful? This is not what the Hebrew says. In Hebrew, she asks, my husband is old, shall I have pleasure? The Hebrew term for pleasure is Edna, a cognate of Eden, as in garden of. Sarah is talking about the joy of conceiving. I remember this verse, Genesis 18:12, since it reminds me of Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, with the cannons booming. The birth of Isaac. All goes according to prediction. Although the narrator discreetly does not tell us about the conversation Abraham and Sarah must have had after the visitors departed, after several more adventures, including Abraham's pleading that God spare Sodom and Gomorrah should 10 righteous people be found, and King Abimelech of Gerar's taking Sarah into his household, just as an earlier Pharaoh had taken Sarah into his household, the prediction comes to fruition. Genesis 21 verse 1 states, the Lord dealt with Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. I'm not thrilled with this translation. Dealt with, to me, has a negative connotation. I have to deal with the leaky faucet or paperwork. The Hebrew offers the more poetic. And Yahweh visited, Hebrew pakad, Sarah as he said, and Yahweh did for Sarah as he had spoken. Visited suggests not leaky faucets, but welcome guests. It suggests a house call. The Hebrew term can be neutral, negative, or positive. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 16, God from the burning bush commands Moses, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have given heed to you, literally visiting, I have visited, and to what has been done to you in Egypt. Following Samuel's birth, and then his mother, Hannah's, bringing the child to the priest at Shiloh, 1 Samuel 2:21 reads, the Lord took note of Hannah. She conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. Took note is pakad, visited. Genesis 21 begins with a focus on Abraham, but it continually returns to Sarah. The second verse states, Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. The next verse is repetitive. Abraham gave the name Isaac to his son, whom Sarah bore him. In a humorous sense, I suspect the author wants to make very clear both that Abraham is the father and that the child emerged from Sarah's body. Following the note that Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him, his son, yes, we've gotten the point. The narrator, for a 4th and 5th time, stresses Abraham's paternity. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Genesis chapter 1, verse 5. In non-biblical sources from the ancient Near East, Greece and Rome, as well as in many other cultures, gods father children. Samson's father may well have been an angel, as we'll see in chapter 2. Early Jewish sources suggest divine paternity in the cases of Noah and Melchizedek. Stories of divine paternity have also been read back into the story of the conception of Isaac. For example, the 1st century CE Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria suggested that Isaac was not just in a metaphorical but also in a natural sense God's son. Further, in his epistle to the Galatians, Paul offers an allegorical interpretation of conceptions and births of Ishmael and Isaac. He writes, 1. The child of the enslaved woman, i.e. Ishmael, was born according to the flesh. The other, the child of the free woman, i.e. Isaac, was born through the promise. Galatians chapter 4, verse 23. The enslaved woman is Hagar. The free woman is Sarah. Born according to the flesh, Greek kata sarka, suggests a physical relationship. And when Paul talks about flesh, he means the human body. Our concern is the description of Isaac as having been born through the promise. Perhaps Paul, like Philo, had some sense of Isaac's divine paternity. Historians cannot resolve the question of how ancient readers, whether of Genesis or of Galatians, understood the practical matters of Isaac's conception and birth. Nor should we presume that all readers left the delivery room with the same interpretation. That a centenarian couple had a child should be miracle enough. We can take the point one more step. We can see that any conception and birth of a child who is wanted, a child who is loved, are sites of divine visitation. The scene ends with Sarah saying, God has brought laughter, Hebrew, shakah, from the same root as Isaac. For me, everyone who hears will laugh with me. Who would ever have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. Genesis chapter 21, verses 6 and 7. The stress on her bearing a child echoes the earlier stress on Hagar's having done the same thing. I appreciate that Sarah notes that people will be laughing with her rather than at her. The laughter that should continue through the generations is not only the laughter that comes with the joy of a healthy baby and good experiences with lactation. Too often the elderly, I count myself among them, are laughed at when the subject comes to anything physical, let alone sexual. Apparently, sexual concerns for women are supposed to stop about the same time we become eligible for Social Security. The Bible is an earthly text, and its phrasing suggests that we are to think positively about senior sexuality. For those who might scoff at Sarah's motherhood in her advanced age, she takes the offensive. She will laugh first. To anticipate the nativity stories of Jesus, there is joy in good news, in hospitality, in childbirth, and even in the act of conception. There is attention to women's bodies, virginal, pregnant, sterile, menopausal. More, there is attention to women's pain and to pleasure. The angels, commenting on the elderly couple's doubts about this future conception, ask, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? Genesis 18, verse 14. There was so much to laugh about and much to ponder. And then, Ishmael and Isaac grow up. Sarah, jealous of Abraham's first son and perhaps jealous of Hagar as well, insists that the two be banished. Abraham loved Ishmael. The text does not comment on his view of Hagar or hers of him, but God instructs him to listen to Sarah's voice. Abraham expels his son Ishmael and Ishmael's mother from their home and into the wilderness. Isaac remains at home with his mother. In Genesis 22, the next chapter, God tests Abraham's loyalty by commanding him to kill Isaac, and Abraham is prepared to comply. When Abraham is about to kill Isaac, God recognizes Abraham's fidelity. The child is spared when an angel calls down from heaven in a different type of annunciation, this one an affirmation rather than a new prediction. Because you have done this, and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. Genesis chapter 22, verses 15 through 18. The followers of Jesus early on saw in Genesis 22 a prediction of the cross. On the other hand, after this event, God never again speaks to Abraham, and Isaac and Abraham never again speak to each other. More, immediately after Genesis 22, this test of Abraham, we read that Sarah dies. What was left that Abraham had to say to Sarah before it was too late? What would Isaac have said to his mother, or she to him? What else do we need to say? There was much more to say about Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, Ishmael and Isaac, but the seeds have been planted for stories to come, about moving from one place to another to find a home, about desperate acts of desperate people, about slavery and agency, about rivalries and status, divine appearances and human reactions, miraculous conceptions, and, for readers, conceiving the miracle.